This is a quiet voice. Tonight, I want to share a story about a human choice so small it felt invisible at first, yet so powerful it quietly reshaped an entire life long after it was made. It's a story about the difference between being alone and being solitary, and how easy it is to confuse safety with isolation. Elias lived his life by the rhythm of the sun and the low, steady hum that vibrated through the floorboards of his farmhouse. To most people, that sound would have been unsettling, a constant reminder of the thousands of stinging insects just yards away. But for Elias, it was the very definition of peace. He was a man of few words, preferring the company of the apiary that stretched out behind his kitchen garden. 50 white boxes stood there like a miniature city in the tall grass, housing thousands of souls that he knew better than his own neighbors. His hands were weathered, mapped with the history of stings and labor, and his skin carried the faint, sweet scent of beeswax and pine smoke, a perfume that had been worn by his father and his grandfather before him. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a trait he had learned from the creatures he tended. He understood that sudden movements only invited defensive strikes, and that patience was not just a virtue, but a survival tactic. Yet, on this particular morning, the air felt different. It hung heavy with a humidity that had nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with the letter sitting unopened on his kitchen table. It was a sharp corner of white against the dark, scarred wood, waiting to unravel the quiet life he had built. As he poured his coffee, the steam rising in the pale dawn light, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hum beneath the floorboards had changed its pitch, shifting from a lullaby into a warning. The letter was from Julian, his younger brother, the same Julian who had left the valley 20 years ago with a duffel bag and a promise never to return to a life of dirt and stingers. Julian had sought the concrete and glass of the city, where noise was a shield against his own thoughts, and silence was something he was secretly afraid to face. Elias hadn't heard his brother's voice in over a decade, save for the occasional polite holiday card that felt more like an obligation than a greeting, usually penned by a secretary Elias had never met. The envelope was thick, the handwriting rushed, and it carried a return address that spoke of high rises and urgency. It was a stark contrast to the slow, blooming clover and the lazy drift of the morning fog that currently wrapped around the hives. Elias knew, with the intuition of a man who spent his days reading the subtle shifts in nature, that Julian wasn't writing to catch up on old times. He wasn't asking about the honey harvest. He was asking for something that would require Elias to break the stillness he had so carefully curated. He took a sip of the bitter, black coffee, his eyes fixing on the window where a single worker bee was bumping gently against the glass. She was trying to find her way back to the colony, and he felt a pang of sympathy for her confusion. He realized that he, too, was trapped behind an invisible barrier of dread. He was delaying the moment when he would have to slice open the paper seal and let the noise of the outside world rush in. He knew that once the words were read, they could never be unread. When he finally gathered the courage to slide his thumb under the flap and unfold the single sheet of crisp stationery, the words were fewer than he expected, but heavier than he could bear. Julian was coming home, not for a visit, but to settle the estate. It was a phrase that sounded legal and cold, implying that the farm was nothing more than lines on a map and assets in a ledger, rather than the living, breathing entity Elias tended to every day. The letter mentioned market values, developers, and a life-changing opportunity that would allow them both to retire in comfort. It ignored the fact that Elias was already exactly where he wanted to be. His version of comfort did not involve golf courses or condos. It involved the smell of damp earth and the heavy weight of a frame full of honeycomb. The arrival date was set for today. That left Elias no time to prepare his arguments or to fortify his defenses against the charismatic whirlwind that was his brother. Julian was a man who could sell ice to winter, a man who had always viewed the farm as a prison rather than a sanctuary. Elias folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope, as if containing it could contain the threat. He walked out onto the porch, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, looking out over the rows of hives where the morning activity was just beginning. He needed to check the queens. He needed to ensure the colonies were strong. Perhaps he was looking for reassurance from the bees themselves, hoping that their orderly, purposeful existence would ground him before the chaos arrived. He knew that in the world of the hive, the individual mattered less than the whole. But in the world of men, individual desires often burn down the forest just to feel the warmth of the fire. He wondered if he had the strength to stand between the flame and the wood. He pulled on his protective suit, the white canvas stiff and familiar. It was a second skin that transformed him from a man into a keeper. He lit the smoker, packing it with dried burlap and pine needles until cool, thick clouds drifted from the nozzle. The smoke was a tool of ancient design, a way to mask the alarm pheromones of the guard bees, keeping the colony calm while he worked. It was a trick of the trade that felt deceptively like a lie, soothing them while he dismantled their roof. As he approached the first hive, the sound rose to meet him. It was a collective vibration of 50,000 wings beating in unison, a sound that vibrated in his chest and slowed his heart rate. It reminded him of the first lesson his father had taught him about the waggle dance. It is a scientific fact that honeybees communicate through movement, performing a complex figure-8 dance in the dark of the hive to tell their sisters exactly where the best nectar is located. They encode distance and direction relative to the sun with mathematical precision. It is a language without words that never lies, never exaggerates, and never manipulates for personal gain. A bee does not dance to sell a dream. She dances to save her family. Standing there, surrounded by that honest, vibrating hum, Elias felt the stark, painful difference between the world he knew, one of absolute biological clarity, and the world his brother inhabited. He imagined Julian's world of shifting contracts, fine print designed to obscure the truth, and handshakes that meant nothing once the fingers let go. A thin cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, drifting slowly toward the farm like a silent omen, signaling the quiet, irreversible end of his peace. A shiny, rented sedan crunched up the driveway, looking out of place against the faded red of the barn. Julian stepped out, not in the denim and flannel of their youth, but in a sharp suit that cost more than Elias's truck. He looked older, tired around the eyes, but his smile was as bright and practiced as ever. The reunion was stiff, a handshake that lingered too long, a clap on the shoulder that felt like a test of structural integrity. Julian didn't waste time. He talked as he walked, gesturing broadly at the rolling hills, painting a picture not of what was there, but of what could be there. Luxury estates, a weekend getaway for the city elite. He spoke of optimizing assets and liquidating liabilities. Elias walked silently beside him, feeling like a ghost in his own life. He listened as Julian dismantled his memories, turning the creek where they used to catch crawdads into a water feature and the old oak tree into landscaping lumber. But as the sun climbed higher, Elias noticed something else. Beneath the polish and the sail's pitch, Julian's hands were shaking. There was a sheen of sweat on his forehead that the mild temperature couldn't justify. Julian wasn't just excited, he was desperate. They stopped near the apiary. Julian recoiled slightly as a forager zipped past his ear. He asked Elias why he still kept them, why he bothered with the work when he could just buy honey at the store. Elias didn't answer with words. He simply lifted the lid of a hive. He showed Julian the frames, heavy with gold, the meticulous order of the comb. He tried to explain that it wasn't about the honey. It was about the stewardship. It was about being part of something that continued, season after season, regardless of the stock market or the price of real estate. The argument finally erupted over dinner. The polite veneer cracked. Julian slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing in the empty house. The truth didn't come out all at once. It spilled out like broken glass. He confessed, his voice cracking on the words he had been afraid to speak. There was no life-changing opportunity, no golden parachute waiting to carry them to a retirement on the coast. There was only debt. Massive, suffocating debt from a tech venture that had promised to revolutionize the industry, but had only succeeded in wiping out investors' money. It was a gamble that had failed spectacularly, leaving Julian exposed, humiliated, and owing more than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. The creditors were closing in, and the farm was the only collateral Julian had left. He wasn't trying to retire. He was trying to survive. He looked at Elias with pleading eyes, the charismatic salesman stripping away to reveal the frightened little brother who used to be afraid of the dark. Elias sat in silence. The anger he had been nursing all day evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He had the moral high ground. He could say no. He could protect his home, his bees, his peace. Julian had made his own choices. He had left this life behind. Why should Elias sacrifice his sanctuary to pay for Julian's mistakes? It would be justice. It would be fair. And yet, in that fairness, something vital and human would be quietly, permanently broken. But as he looked at his brother's slumped shoulders, he heard the hum from the floorboards again. He walked out into the night. The air was cooling rapidly, a frost warning in effect. He went to the hives. He knew what was happening inside those white boxes. When the temperature drops, honeybees do not hibernate. Instead, they form what is known as a winter cluster. They gather in a tight ball around the queen, vibrating their wing muscles to generate heat. The bees on the outside of the cluster provide insulation, shielding the center from the cold, until exhaustion and falling temperature force them inward and push warmer bees out to take their place. The bees from the center move out to take their turn in the cold, and the cold bees move in to warm up. It is a democracy of warmth, a shared burden where every individual plays a part in the survival of the whole. No bee can survive the winter alone. Elias leaned his head against the wood of the nearest hive. He closed his eyes, listening. He thought of himself, standing on the perimeter, taking the cold hits of loneliness for years to protect the center of this farm. He thought of Julian, out there in the city, freezing in a different kind of cold, trying to survive on his own. They were a cluster, too, whether Elias liked it or not. He had been protecting the land, but he had forgotten to protect the family. He went back inside. Julian was sitting exactly where he had left him, staring into the bottom of a glass. Elias sat down across from him. He didn't offer to sell the farm. He knew that selling the farm would destroy him, and eventually the money would run out for Julian, leaving them both with nothing. Instead, Elias offered a different solution. He spoke of the savings he had accumulated, the honey money that had piled up over decades of simple living. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to hold off the sharks. It was enough to buy time. But there was a condition. Julian had to stay. Elias needed help. The work was getting harder, and the winters were getting colder. He needed someone to handle the books, someone to sell the honey to a wider market, someone to bring that city energy into this quiet valley. He needed a brother, not a neighbor. Julian looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't try to negotiate. He simply nodded. The months that followed were a difficult lesson in coexistence. There was friction, sharp and frequent. The silence of the farmhouse, once sacred, was now broken by the jarring ring of phone calls, the frantic clacking of a keyboard at midnight, and the muffled thump of Julian's terrible taste in modern jazz. Elias had to learn to tolerate the intrusion of technology into his sanctuary, watching Julian turn the dining table into a command center. In turn, Julian had to learn that nature didn't care about his schedule. He learned the hard way that you cannot rush a hive, and that a stung hand is often the price of impatience. But there was also laughter. There was the smell of cooking that Elias didn't have to make. And the business grew. Julian found markets for the beeswax candles and the artisanal honey that Elias had never dreamed of. One evening, deep in winter, Elias stood by the window. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the hives in white. He wasn't worried. He knew the cluster was tight. He knew the heat was holding. He looked back into the warm living room where Julian was asleep in the armchair, a book resting on his chest. Elias realized that peace wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of harmony, even if that harmony included the occasional storm. He had been the cold, hard shell for so long, protecting the center, but Julian had brought a new heat, a new energy that had warmed them both. They would survive the winter. The debt was paid, not just in money, but in understanding. The farm would stand. The bees would fly again in the spring. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Elias felt a profound sense of gratitude for the disruption that had saved him from his own solitude. He took a deep breath of the cooling air, smelling the fallen leaves and the faint, enduring scent of wax, and walked back toward the house where the light in the window was a beacon, promising warmth, rest, and the simple, sweet certainty of a new day. This is a quiet voice. Tonight, as the seasons change and we retreat into our own winter clusters, I hope you find the warmth you need and the courage to share it.